All right, welcome back to Broadsword, where we put the bra in broadsword. We're here with Kevin Gottlieb, the one and only. What's up, dude? Come on, don't break down so
That was
quick.
quite an introduction.
Let's do an icebreaker. What surprised you about seminary?
What surprised me? Um, it's funny, like going into seminary, I thought I knew a lot about the Bible and theology. Um, and I was like, I knew I'd learn stuff, but I didn't realize how much I would learn. Um, there like, and it's like with any field, the deeper you get into it, the more you realize, like, wow, there's so much I don't know. That's why the greatest experts are oftentimes the most humble because they're like, maybe it could be, like, and so I just feel like the deeper I've gotten into it, the more I've realized how much I don't know and how much I still need to learn. But it's been really rewarding. So I wouldn't trade it. I love the training I got. Professors were great, and the professors also just being really pastoral. That was something that was also surprising but really good. It's just seeing how much they cared about my growth.
You were kind of surprised that they are not just teaching, but kind of like shepherding in a way.
Yeah, it's not just like here's some content, see you next week. But it's
Mm-hmm.
like they actually do want to care, and then like meeting them for coffee, um, picking their brain, like trying to figure out, okay, how does this apply to ministry? Like we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about this concept. How does that fit in with what I'm doing over here?
Mm-hmm.
And that was just really good.
Yeah, man.
Mm.
All right. Well, we're gonna dive into biblical narrative today as part of our biblical genre series. Approximately how much of the Bible is biblical narrative? Would you suppose?
I don't have an exact number in front of me. I was trying to find it and I couldn't locate it, but it's over a third at least. You've got most of the Torah. You've got a whole bunch of historical books ranging from Joshua to Second Chronicles is narrative. And you've got narrative interspersed in the prophets, and then you've got the four gospels and the book of Acts
Mm.
are almost all narrative. So it's a really prominent genre in the Old and New Testament.
What do we mean when we say narrative and talk about biblical narrative?
These are stories. So you have stories in these places in the Bible that focus on character or characters or the nation of Israel, and there's plot development and settings and all that. So they have all the elements of that. It's not just a sermon or giving the law or a prophecy or a letter like you'd have in other portions of the Bible.
It's not necessarily commenting on what is good about this or bad about this. It's not
Not
commenting on.
directly.
Yeah.
It actually is commenting, but just not. It's not the explicit like where you have like Paul's letters or the Epistle of James or the law, where it's like this is bad, this is good. It's not explicit, but it is actually giving us moral lessons. It's just doing it in a way that is a little bit more roundabout, but in some ways hits deeper when you understand it. It's a difference between like you could hear someone, for example, we just celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day. You could hear someone talk about his accomplishments, or you could watch the movie Selma. The movie Selma is going to hit a lot harder emotionally because you're actually watching what's happening. You're involved in the story, and you're seeing him go through the different struggles and all that, and that's going to draw you in. So as humans, we're storytelling beings. We tell stories. If you sometimes if you ask people like, "What do you do for work?" and they're like, "Well, I work here, and here's how I got into this field and all that," and they start telling you a story. Like we think of ourselves as storytelling beings, and that's why stories are so impactful. And I mean, you know that because you help make stories for a
Mm-hmm.
living.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point that narrative can be more impactful than just like an article or someone gives you the information just straight up. Like, here's what you need to do or don't do, or here's what God is like. But rather than just like, because, there is that in the Bible, a lot of it in the New Testament. Um, but just telling a story about God or about his people is actually very impactful and in ways a lot more impactful emotionally.
Yeah, and that's why, like one of the most famous Puritan writings of the past several hundred years is Pilgrim's Progress. Most
Mm-hmm.
people don't know Puritan sermons. They may have
Mm-hmm.
read one or two, maybe not, but almost everyone knows Pilgrim's Progress because it's a story. It's a story, it's a parable of the Christian life told through story, and that's far more memorable and far more engaging than reading some old text. So there's a
Yeah. Wow.
lot more you can do with it.
I never thought of that either. That's really cool. What are some basic understandings that we should have as we approach narratives in the Bible?
A lot of times we're taught Bible study and we're taught to be very clinical in how we study the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Like look for, like we're told to kind of almost like dissect the text.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, though you can do some of that. The best thing to do with narrative, number one, is just like immerse yourself. It's always best to read a story from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna get more out of it than because if you start reading it and you stop and you're like, okay, well, what word was used? Like that's not how you that's not how you engage in the story. It's like if someone's watching a movie and keeps pausing it every like 2 minutes, like it's just
Yeah,
you won't
yeah.
get the full effect of it.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
you want to read a story all the way through if possible. You're gonna get the flow of it. You're gonna it's gonna immerse you in it. So that's number one is be careful about being too clinical when approaching stories. You want to engage with the story, allow yourself to be carried along with what the author's doing.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's number one. Is a lot of Christians I think are very quick to jump into the like let's interpret the text, let's exegete it, and yes, that's a part of it, but you also want to feel the emotional impact of what's happening in the story, um, because that's the purpose of it. And this is also the idea that we're unique in human history, and that our primary interaction with the Bible is through reading.
Mm-hmm.
For most of human history, you didn't read scripture, you heard it,
Mm-hmm.
because most people can read, and also copies of the scripture really expensive to produce. So most people heard biblical stories rather than reading it. So you'd actually hear these stories play out in real time.
Mm-hmm.
So you're getting a lot more of that, and that's going to impact how you approach it. We read, and so therefore we can stop whenever we want as a
Mm-hmm.
reading, which can sometimes take us out of the flow of it.
When we're watching a movie, there's always things that happen, especially if it's a movie with twists and turns, that something
Mhm.
happens and you're like, wait, why are they doing this? But like in my mind, I'm like, I know I'm gonna find out. If the movie's done
Yeah,
well, then I'm not gonna be
yeah,
left confused. So I'm just gonna like hold
yeah,
my question in, hold that thought, and then just
yeah,
wait to see how it plays out. Where, my wife a lot of times will pause it immediately and
yeah,
be like, wait, why is he doing that? And I'm like,
yeah,
if I haven't seen the movie, I'm like, I don't know. Like, let's just
yeah,
keep watching. Or if I
yeah,
have seen the movie, I'm just like, just hit play. Like
yeah,
you're gonna figure
yeah.
it out. I think a lot of skeptics or unbelievers can approach Christianity with so many questions up front without actually having read the story itself.
Hmm.
And a lot of questions can be answered by just reading the whole thing.
Hmm.
A lot more questions are going to come up, but a lot of the questions that they already had are probably going to be answered.
You'll have stories that are going to give you the information that you need. And sometimes it doesn't give you the information that you want, which annoys some people. So, for example, in Genesis, you have uh, Cain and Abel who marry and have kids. And you're like, wait a second, where did they get these wives?
Yeah.
Story doesn't tell. The author didn't think that was necessary for us to know.
Wait, did Abel have kids?
Well, Abel may not have had kids, but we know Cain got married and had kids, and
Yeah.
then Seth, the later brother, he also had kids and got married and all that. But the question is, people always ask, like, where did these women come from? Text doesn't say. So if the text doesn't say, like if you're watching a sci-fi movie and some aliens show up, and you're like, well, where did these aliens come from? But the point of the movie is not where they came from. The point is the interaction between the aliens and the humans.
Mm.
You can obsess over where the aliens came from, but the screenwriter, that wasn't his point. He wanted to focus on something else. So
That's really
yeah, so
good.
reading the context is really important. Understanding And also there's several layers of context. So you have usually like the small story,
Yeah.
which is usually called a pericope, like the small story that's usually set within a larger story. So, for example, in the book of Genesis, you have a whole bunch of small stories. So it's like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like each one of them have these set of small stories, but they're part of the larger story of Genesis, which is part of the larger story of the Pentateuch, which is part of the larger story of the Bible. So, like, you have those different layers of stories as well.
Mm.
So, reading the story of Abraham and Isaac in its context of not just the story itself, but also the larger story of Genesis, and
Mm-hmm.
then the larger story of the Pentateuch.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a quick and easy task. It takes a lot of study, a lot of reading. Um, and this is why Bible in the Year plans can be really good, because they're taking you through the Bible and those parts that you normally wouldn't go to.
Mm-hmm.
Shed light sometimes.
And
Yeah,
then
exactly.
sometimes we don't know why something played out a certain way in a story in Genesis, but then later on,
Hmm.
even thousands of years later after Christ comes, we're like, oh, I see why that played out that way. What's another basic understanding that we should approach narrative with?
Yeah. So another one is descriptive versus prescriptive. Um, this is where a lot of Christians can get really confused when they read some of the stories. So what narrative does is, remember we talked about this earlier about, like, is it telling us what to do?
Hmm.
It is, but just not the way we think it is. So um descriptive, this is where you see a lot, like in the law and the epistles, the letters in the New Testament. You'll get a lot of do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. It's very prescriptive. It's telling you exactly what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or Jesus has different commands like love one another, be kind, those are prescriptive. They're telling us what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Descriptive is just describing what happened. It's not explicitly telling us this is what you should do. It's describing what's happening and we're watching how it plays out.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the Old Testament patriarchs had multiple wives. That's not a prescriptive. It's not saying, oh, they did this, therefore we should do that. It's just saying they did. And it actually is giving some more lessons, because each one of the patriarchs who does that, who takes on multiple wives and concubines, it's a disaster. They have tons of family drama. It always creates a disaster whenever it's tried. Another example would be like Gideon, for example. He puts out that fleece. Like the famous example of Gideon's fleece. Like
Mm-hmm.
God tells him, I'm going to be with you. You're the chosen one who's going to drive the enemies out. And Gideon's like, yeah, okay, but I need to know for sure. Even though the angel of the Lord's already appeared before him, already done a miracle, he still has to put out the fleece.
Yeah.
And then the miracle happens where the ground's wet and the fleece is dry, and he's like, okay, well, I want to reverse it this time. I want the fleece to be wet, the ground to be dry.
Yeah.
That's not a prescription telling us this is how we should test God's will. Like, that's
Mm.
not telling us this is what we should do. Like, should I take this job or not? Like, let me put out a fleece on the ground. Like,
Yeah.
no, it's actually highlighting Gideon's lack of faith. If anything, it's showing that, like, God's already approached him, God's already told him what to do, and Gideon is still not trusting God.
Mm.
Uh, so that, some, like, that's one of those things where it's not telling us this is how we should do things. It's telling us what happened, and then as we're reading the story, we realize, oh, Gideon's big thing is a lack of faith, and you can see that all throughout his life. He's constantly doubting God.
Mm.
Uh, so that's where it's telling us it's giving us a lesson, but not in the here's the lesson, but in the look at what happened to Gideon and look at his trajectory.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've always thought about the fleece thing as like, I mean, I guess we could ask God to do certain things like this, but it feels odd. Um,
Yeah, it's one of those things that it doesn't. If you really think about it, if you read it in the context of his whole life story, um, it's actually it's a pretty, it's highlighting the fact that he doesn't have faith, because he already, like, the angel of God already appears to Gideon earlier on, and basically so the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon. Gideon doubts immediately. He's like, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. the angel of the Lord basically says, "So bring some offerings to me," and then touches it with his staff, and the whole thing catches on fire.
Yeah.
Like crazy miracle.
Yeah.
Like, yeah,
Oh my god.
I'm gonna need some. We're gonna have to get a fleece.
That's
Um,
funny, dude.
yeah.
And
So
it's like it also like sheds light on what a lot of people would say in this day and age of like, well, if I just saw a miracle, or if
mhm,
Jesus appeared in front of me, like I would just believe, like that's all he has to do. I would believe the
yeah,
rest of my life. And I tell those people, no, you
yeah,
like yeah, you would believe in a sense because you just saw him, but like that wouldn't lead to heart change, wouldn't change your life.
yeah. The Israelites are a prime example of that. They see the plagues on Egypt. They see the crossing of the Red Sea, and then they complain. Um,
Yeah, yeah, totally.
so human nature, and you see this the people of Jesus' time saw him do miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Pharisees saw him heal people, and then left to go off and plot how to kill him.
Yeah,
Like that's it's crazy when you think about it, but
yeah.
it just shows that like human nature, we would not. We're far more. We have far less faith than we think we do. Because really, that's not faith. Like
Mm-hmm.
someone showing a miracle,
That's not faith.
it's not.
That's
It's like
that's
okay, you saw.
sight. That's sight. A lot of like I would say the contrast in the Bible of faith is sight.
Yeah, yeah,
Like that's a theme that runs through the whole Bible.
exactly. Yeah, and that's why like once someone, you and I have talked about this, once someone dies and appears before God at the end in judgment, there's no longer a place for faith.
Mm-hmm.
You can't be like, okay, now I have faith in Jesus. Well, no,
Mm-hmm.
you see
Yeah.
him in all his glory. Like there's no more chance for faith to have any bearing there because you're actually seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if a miracle is what gets you into Christianity, and that's like the deciding factor, then you're almost like reliant on that to continue your walk. Like, well, I need to keep seeing miracles. Like
Right.
when things are hard, I need more miracles. I need more miracles,
If
and
that's
that's
how it started, that's how it has to continue. Uh-huh.
exact. If that's what draws you, that's what's going to have to keep you.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's
Yep.
really good. This may be a little controversial, but are there any examples in the New Testament, like Acts and in the early church, that you would see as prescriptive and not, or descriptive and not necessarily prescriptive?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the way the apostles do things are unique. Um, and that's because of their role as apostles. So you have them driving out demons, healing people, speaking with authority. So like an apostle can do things that a normal pastor or priest can't do.
Hmm.
And even there's this early work called the Didache, which is one of the earliest Christian documents that we have, and it gives like a little mini liturgy for how to do a worship service. And they give different prayers and all that. And there's a funny little line in it that says, "But if an apostle shows up, he can do communion however he wants to do it. Like he gets to do whatever prayer he wants because he's an apostle. He has different authority." Um, and so, in also too, like the early churches were house churches because that's the only that they didn't have church buildings back then.
Yeah.
So I would say those are descriptive, not saying that you can only do church in people's houses.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's just describing what's happening early on because that's how it could happen. There are some denominations that will say like, well, we only do what's in the New Testament. And it's like, okay, well, the New Testament's silent about a lot of things. Like it doesn't tell you a lot how a worship service should be conducted. It really doesn't. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
read through it, it's really vague, and I think that's intentional. Like it gives Christians a lot of flexibility for how to do church.
Yeah. Paul says like, don't fight about what day you worship or what day you meet together.
Yeah, the early church had to really figure out what's descriptive and what's prescriptive
Mm-hmm.
in the Old Testament, and they also, I mean, this we're going on a little bit of a rabbit trail, but they had to decide, look, how much of the Old Testament applies to us now, and that was a whole theological debate about the Old Testament law and all that. So, but
Yeah.
yeah, reading things in narrative can really help you you start to get the lessons that are being taught. Um, and it starts showing you, like, once again, the polygamy thing. At the beginning, you're like, well, why isn't the Bible condemning this? Well,
Yeah.
it is, not explicitly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. Same with the slavery thing. Like, well,
mhm.
people will say, well, God, well, the Bible doesn't tell people to revolt against it or to rise up against it. And it's like, well, Paul is saying, like, free this guy. He's your brother in Christ. Like,
Yeah.
don't have him as a slave anymore.
Yeah.
Um, as you're studying narrative in the Bible, because it's not necessarily like speaking directly to us, saying like, "Hey, you should do this or that," or "This is what God is like," but it's more story. Like, what are some tools or techniques that you use to derive meaning and interpretation when reading
Yeah.
narrative?
It's a good, great question. First one, like I said earlier, read it, read the whole thing.
Hmm.
So don't take little slices, because
Mm-hmm.
it's very hard to understand a story if you're only taking bits and pieces of it. Pay attention to things like repetition, because remember, it's an oral culture. Like, people were hearing the word of God, they weren't reading it. Repetition is key, especially in the Old Testament. Things that are important get repeated. Pay attention to things that are like irony and satire. Sometimes authors will show how a situation is actually ridiculous. So sometimes they're not, once again, they're not endorsing a situation. They're just showing how ridiculous it is. Like Samson, the story of Samson is one of those things where you have this guy who's born to be a Nazarite, and a Nazarite, you couldn't cut your hair, you couldn't touch dead animals, and you couldn't drink fermented drink like wine. So those are the three things for a Nazarite. And if you look at him, he breaks every single one of those, and it's like ironic how much he breaks them too. Like, he gets drunk multiple times throughout the story of Samson. Like, he's constantly getting drunk. He's constantly touching dead things. Kills a lion, goes back and gets honey from it. Kills a whole bunch of men with what? A donkey's jawbone. That's a dead animal he's touching. He could have grabbed a sword
Yeah, yeah,
from.
yeah.
He uses that. Like, he's constantly breaking this. It's like ironic. Like, you just see, you're like, oh my gosh, like, this guy's out of control.
Mm-hmm.
And he boasts about it too. Like, I've slain men with a donkey of a jawbone. He's proud about
Yeah.
it. So yeah, pay attention to stuff like that. And then if you don't understand the story, read it again. And if you still don't understand it, come back to it later. Read more of the Bible, and maybe if you once again read something later on, you come back to, you're like, oh, okay, that clarifies that.
Yeah.
Um, like, for example, the story of Ruth is a really powerful story, but it becomes more powerful knowing that Ruth is a great grandmother or the grandmother of David. Like, it adds more context to that story. You don't know that yet if you've just read Ruth.
Yeah.
And you read First and Second Samuel, you're like, oh, okay, and like,
Yeah.
it sheds more light. So when you come back to Ruth, you're like, okay.
Yeah.
I'll give you another good one, is Genesis 38. So you have the story of Joseph, right? So Joseph, has these dreams. He's given this robe of many colors, and his brothers get so jealous that they throw him into slavery, right? And then you have this weird story in Genesis 38 of Judah and Tamar that just seems to like just drop right in the middle. And a lot of scholars thought, like, okay, some random, editor put this in there
Hmm.
because they didn't know how to like feel like, what does this have to do with the story of Joseph? Doesn't make any sense. Then you read 39, you have the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And then you realize it's like
Oh.
Judah and Tamar and Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Like, Judah is unfaithful. Like, Judah doesn't give his third son to Tamar, and he sleeps with this woman he thinks is a prostitute. It's actually Tamar. Like, he goes in with her. Like, he's fully willing. Whereas Joseph is completely faithful to God and resists Potiphar's wife. Like, you see them in contrast. But then you see later on that Judah's son through Tamar goes into the lineage of David, if you read further on in the biblical narrative, even despite his unfaithfulness. And
Hmm.
Matthew has Tamar in the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
there's like a whole bunch of stuff that, like, if you just read it, you're like, I don't get this.
Yeah.
What the heck is this? Is so weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But then if you read it, oh, you see the contrast, Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Oh, okay, there's a contrast there. And then you read later about Judah's lineage, like, oh, and it's just God would work through this very sinful encounter to bring forth something glorious.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. I think we've covered a lot about narrative. Anything that we may have missed or that you want to touch on?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I encourage you to there's some really good books about the like how biblical narrative works.
Mm-hmm.
One of the best books I've read, it's not written by a Christian, it's written by a Jewish scholar, but it's really good. It's called The Art of the Biblical Narrative by Robert Alter.
Hmm.
He's one of the people who, in the 1970s, he really kicked off this big focus on narrative and how narrative works. So that's really good. And there's other stuff that's really good as well, but just don't rush through narrative. Take your time with it.
There's a lot of things that we're not going to understand without going to something like a historical commentary.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we
Yeah,
don't get everything that's happening around these characters and these people or their culture.
exactly.
And there's things that are it's not written to us. It's actually written to people in that time when it was written, and for people in that time when it was written, and people then would have understood it very differently than we do now. And so
Yeah,
historical commentators, which have, some people have dedicated their whole life to Genesis, and they've written a commentary on it. It's like, well, I
hmm,
don't want to dedicate my whole life to Genesis, so I'm just going to
yeah,
read his stuff and then get
yeah,
a lot of knowledge from it.
yeah. Historical commentaries are great because they can really like yeah fill in a lot of that. But you always want to once again read the story by yourself first,
Yeah,
and like just sit in it, and then go to the commentary. So don't jump to the commentary first, but
yeah,
go to the story itself, read it, and then you're like, okay, I'm still a little confused.
yeah.
The commentaries, you're right, can then shed light because these scholars have can like say, oh, well, here this is what the Hittite people were, or
Hmm.
this is what this, or here's the geography that's being covered here.
Yeah.
Like the Book of Joshua, there's all these battles that move all over the place,
Mm-hmm.
and if you don't have a good map, like you and I have both seen some good maps on it, if you don't understand what's going on, you're like, what is this? Like, you're confused.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Awesome, awesome. Some sound advice there.
you're a storyteller. What do you have to add? Come on, you work with stories.
I like what you said. Like that was really good. That's something I would say, which is the effective way to get your point across to somebody is put it into a story, put
The
it into a
best,
narrative where you have
yeah,
these literary elements that are designed to draw people in and to hit them over the head with a message when they're not looking, and
I will
then
tell you that
leave them with that message after the story is done.
exactly, and I'll tell you one of the you can see this all over the place. The best salespeople are the best storytellers. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you look at and even this like the big ones like Theranos and like some of the big startups that failed,
Yeah.
WeWork and all that. If you actually like watch the presentations of the founders, they'll tell you a story. They're immersing you in this story of like I had this vision, this dream for this thing, and here's a story from my past, and we can do this. Like they're drawing you in. Like, do you want to join this story? And you're like, yes, I want to join that story. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
give me your money. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
but yeah,
Because
the best stories are in.
people don't want to be told what to do.
Mhm.
They want to make their own decisions. And when you're telling a story, you're not telling them what to do. You're just
Yeah,
giving them information. And then they decide in their own heart while they're hearing that, oh, I
yeah,
want to do that. And then
yeah,
it's their decision and not you telling them what to do. That's
yeah.
how stories are also so effective.
I agree. I
It's like
agree.
inception, it's planting the idea in their mind.
Mm.
And then they think it was their idea, but really it was your idea. And you just told a compelling story.
Gotta go deeper.
So, yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
dude. I love you, bro. To all of our fans out there, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. Bye.